Section 1. The Breaking Point. Have you ever watched your entire world collapse in slow motion? Not in a dramatic explosion, but in a quiet, devastating unraveling where every thread you've carefully woven just falls apart? That moment when you realize the universe isn't ignoring you, it's actively rewriting your script. And the worst part, you never auditioned for this role. Let me tell you about Daniel. Daniel was 29 years old, and he had everything mapped out. Not in a casual, I have some goals way, but in the kind of meticulous, color-coded, spreadsheet-backed way that would make control freaks everywhere nod in approval. He was an architect, which honestly made perfect sense. His whole life was about blueprints, precise measurements, structural integrity. If you could plan it, calculate it, and build it to specification, Daniel was your guy. His morning routine? Time to the second. Coffee brewed at exactly 6:47 a.m. Temperature calibrated to 175 degrees. 40-minute run on the same route he'd perfected over 2 years. Shower at 7:35, dressed by 7:52, out the door at 8:03 to catch the northbound train that arrived at 8:17. You might think this sounds exhausting, and you'd be right. But Daniel didn't see it that way. To him, this was safety. This was control. This was proof that if you just planned well enough, executed precisely enough, life couldn't surprise you. Spoiler alert, life had other ideas. It was a Thursday morning when everything started crumbling, and like most disasters, it began with something small. Daniel had been working for 9 months on what he called the Meridian Project, a sustainable housing development that would revolutionize affordable urban living. It was brilliant, it was innovative, and it was entirely his vision. The presentation to the investors was scheduled for 10 a.m. Daniel had rehearsed 23 times. Yes, 23. He'd timed each slide transition, memorized every data point, prepared responses to 47 potential questions. He knew this presentation better than he knew his own address. He arrived at the firm at 8:45, early, as always. He set up his laptop, checked the projector 3 times, and ran through his opening lines one final time in the bathroom mirror. At 9:55, the investors filed in. 6 people who held the future of his project in their perfectly manicured hands. Daniel started strong. His opening was crisp, confident. He clicked to slide 4, the one showing the environmental impact projections, and the screen went black. Not flickering, not frozen, just black. Technical issue? Someone muttered. The IT guy rushed in, fingers flying over keyboards. 2 minutes passed, then 5, then 10. The investors were checking their phones. The energy in the room had shifted from anticipation to impatience. Just continue without the visuals, Victoria, his supervisor, whispered urgently. So Daniel tried. He attempted to paint the picture with words alone, to convey 9 months of architectural genius through verbal description. But the lead investor, a sharp-eyed woman named Margaret Chen, kept interrupting. But what about the structural load on the eastern wing? How does this compare to the Morrison development in Brooklyn? Your sustainability claims, where's the data backing that up? Questions he had answers for. Questions his slides would have answered perfectly. But without the visuals, without the carefully orchestrated flow, Daniel found himself fumbling. His carefully constructed narrative collapsed like a poorly engineered building. By the time the IT team fixed the projector, 28 minutes had passed. The investors had mentally checked out. Daniel could see it in their eyes, that glazed-over look that said, "We've already made our decision, and it's not in your favor." He pushed through the remaining slides, but it was like performing CPR on something already gone. When he finished, the silence in the room was deafening. Margaret Chen closed her portfolio. "Daniel, we appreciate the effort, but this isn't what we expected. We'll be in touch." Corporate speak for "don't hold your breath." After they left, Victoria pulled him into her office. Her face was kind, but her words were surgical. "Daniel, I vouched for you on this. I told the partners you were ready for a project of this magnitude. Today wasn't just a presentation. It was your proof of concept, and it didn't land." "The technical failure wasn't my fault," Daniel said, hearing the defensiveness in his own voice. "No, but how you handled it was your responsibility. You've built your entire approach around control, around everything going according to plan. But architecture, real life, requires the ability to adapt, to improvise, to stay steady when the unexpected happens." Her words landed like punches. "Your moment," she'd called it, past tense. Daniel left her office feeling like he'd been hollowed out. The rest of the day passed in a fog. Colleagues asked how it went, and he gave vague non-answers. By 6 p.m., he couldn't take the sympathetic looks anymore. He left early, something he never did. The train ride home felt longer than usual. Daniel stared at his reflection in the dark window, watching the city blur past. 9 months. 9 months of late nights, of sacrificed weekends, of canceled plans with friends who'd eventually stopped inviting him places. 9 months of pouring himself into something that had just evaporated in under an hour. He got off at his stop and walked the 6 blocks to his studio loft, a converted warehouse space in what used to be the industrial district. Normally, he loved this walk, the transition from crowded streets to quiet cobblestones, the way the old brick buildings caught the evening light. Tonight, he noticed none of it. Inside his loft, Daniel dropped his messenger bag by the door and stood in the center of the room, not sure what to do with himself. The space was immaculate, of course, everything in its designated place, his drafting table perfectly organized, his bookshelf alphabetized, his life arranged with architectural precision. And yet, he felt completely lost. He pulled out his phone, mindlessly scrolling through social media, looking for anything to distract from the soundtrack of failure playing on repeat in his mind. That's when he saw it, an ad that felt almost eerily targeted. A book. The image showed a simple cover with a single phrase, "The Art of Falling Forward." The tagline beneath it read, "What if your failures aren't ending your story? They're just editing it." Daniel stared at that line. Something about it pierced through the numbness. He wasn't a big reader. The last book he'd finished was probably a technical manual on sustainable building materials. But this felt like the universe was tapping him on the shoulder. Without overthinking it, he clicked "Buy now." The book arrived the next afternoon, delivered to the firm's front desk. Daniel took it home that evening, made himself a cup of chamomile tea, different from his usual black coffee, but today felt like a day for breaking patterns, and opened to the first page. The opening line stopped him cold. Nothing in your life is permanent. Not your successes, not your failures, not even your pain. The sooner you accept this, the sooner you can start living. Daniel read it again, then a third time. Permanent. He'd spent his entire adult life trying to create permanence, permanent routines, permanent structures, permanent success. The idea that everything was temporary felt almost threatening, like someone had just told him that gravity was optional. But he kept reading. The book told a story about a village by the sea that experienced a terrible drought. For months, no rain fell. The fishing boat sat idle because the fish had migrated to deeper waters. The crops withered. Every morning, the villagers would scan the horizon, praying for clouds. Every evening, they'd go to bed under the same merciless, clear sky. Their despair grew. Their hope faded. They began to believe that this drought was their new reality, that suffering was now their permanent state. Then one morning, an old fisherman named Thomas appeared in the village square. He'd been at sea for weeks and hadn't heard about the drought. When the villagers rushed to him desperate for wisdom, he listened to their stories and then said something that confused everyone. Your suffering feels permanent because you've stopped believing in change. But tell me, has the sea ever stayed perfectly calm? Have the tides ever stopped moving? Has a single season ever lasted forever? He gestured toward the ocean. The waves come and go. The moon waxes and wanes. Your children grow taller each year. Even the rocks beneath our feet are slowly being worn smooth by wind and water. Everything in nature is in constant motion. So why do you believe your hardship is the one thing that will never change? The villagers had no answer. This drought will end, the old fisherman continued, not because I'm wise, but because nothing lasts. Not the good times, not the bad times. When the rain finally comes, and it will, I hope you'll remember this lesson, because the abundance you'll celebrate will also be temporary. And that's not sad. That's the rhythm of existence. 3 days later, it rained. Daniel set the book down and stared at the ceiling of his loft. The exposed beams and ductwork that he'd always found aesthetically pleasing suddenly looked different, like visible proof of structure, of the bones beneath the surface that most people never see. He thought about his failed presentation. In that conference room, it had felt permanent, like he'd carved failure into the stone of his professional reputation, and it would be there forever. But what if it wasn't? What if this was just temporary? He picked up his phone and opened his notes app. He started writing, not for any particular purpose, just to get the thoughts out of his head. Everything is temporary. The success I've had, the failure I experienced today, my morning routine, my fear, my confidence, my job, my life in this city, all of it, temporary. I've been living like if I could just build the perfect structure, create the perfect plan, I could make things permanent. But that's not how life works. That's not even how buildings work. Everything shifts, settles, weathers, changes. So what if instead of fighting impermanence, I worked with it? Daniel didn't know what that meant yet, but something had shifted. The book was still open on his lap, waiting to teach him more. He glanced at the next chapter heading, Practice Gratitude, the foundation you didn't know you were missing. But before he could read further, his phone buzzed. A text from Leo. his best friend from university. "Drinks tomorrow? You've been MIA for weeks, man." Old Daniel would have typed, "Too busy with work." This Daniel, this slightly different version who just had his world shaken, typed back, "Yeah, I need it actually." Leo's response came immediately. "Everything okay?" Daniel thought about it. Was everything okay? His project had failed. His supervisor had lost confidence in him. His carefully controlled life had just revealed itself to be far more fragile than he'd believed. But here's the thing. He was still here, still breathing, still capable of meeting a friend for drinks. The presentation disaster felt enormous, but it wasn't actually the end of anything. It was just a moment, a temporary moment in a much longer story. "Not okay," he typed back, "but maybe that's okay too." He set his phone down and returned to the book, ready to learn what came next. Because if impermanence was real, if nothing lasted forever, good or bad, then this pain he was feeling wasn't permanent either. And somehow that thought felt like the first deep breath he'd taken in days. Outside his window, the city hummed with evening life. Somewhere out there, people were celebrating victories and mourning losses. Somewhere, someone was experiencing their best day ever, while someone else was surviving their worst. And all of it was temporary. Daniel turned the page and kept reading, not because he had answers, but because he was finally ready to ask better questions. Section 2. The Gratitude Awakening. Friday morning arrived differently than usual. Daniel's alarm went off at 6:30, same as always, but instead of immediately launching into his timed routine, he did something strange. He just lay there for a moment, looking at the ceiling, breathing. His studio loft had these massive windows that faced east, and the morning light was pouring in, painting everything in shades of amber and gold. He'd lived here for 3 years and couldn't remember the last time he'd actually noticed the sunrise. It was always just morning, the starting gun for his carefully orchestrated day. Today, he watched the light shift across the exposed brick wall. Temporary, he thought. This exact configuration of light and shadow would never happen again. This specific morning, with its particular quality of illumination, was already disappearing even as he experienced it. The thought should have made him anxious. Instead, it felt oddly liberating. He got up, made coffee, didn't check the temperature, and opened the book to where he'd left off the night before. Practice gratitude, the foundation you didn't know you were missing. The chapter opened with a question that made him uncomfortable. When was the last time you appreciated something before it disappeared? Daniel set his coffee down. When was the last time? He tried to remember, genuinely tried, and came up blank. The book continued. We move through life like tourists rushing through a museum, barely glancing at the masterpieces before hurrying to the next room. We assume everything will always be available to us. That friend who always answers your calls, you assume they always will. Your health? You treat it like it's guaranteed. Your ability to walk, see, think, create, all taken for granted until they're threatened. Daniel thought about his studio. How many times had he complained about the noise from the street below? about the temperamental heating system, about the rent being too high for the square footage. But he had a home, a safe space. Millions of people didn't, and he'd never once, not once, stopped to feel grateful for it. The book shared a story that hit him like a freight train. There was once a renowned chef who complained constantly. His kitchen staff was never fast enough. His suppliers never delivered ingredients at peak freshness. His customers didn't appreciate the nuance of his creations. Food critics were too harsh. Michelin stars were political. Nothing was ever quite right. One morning, he woke up and couldn't taste anything. A rare neurological condition had stolen his sense of taste overnight. Suddenly, all those complaints evaporated. He didn't care about the staff's speed anymore. He didn't care about critics. He would have given everything he owned, his restaurant, his reputation, his savings, just to taste salt again, just to experience the brightness of lemon or the umami depth of aged cheese. In the hospital, he told his wife, through tears, "I spent 30 years complaining about flavor profiles and ingredient quality. Now I'd give anything to taste hospital food. Anything." The story ended with a single question. What are you taking for granted right now that you'll desperately miss when it's gone? Daniel closed the book and looked around his loft with new eyes. His hands. He looked down at them, really looked. These hands could sketch, could draft, could bring ideas from his imagination into physical form. They could type, touch, create. How many people had lost that ability? And when had he last thought, "I'm grateful my hands work"? Never. The answer was never. His eyesight. He could see the morning light, could read this book, could appreciate color and form and beauty. Vision was his entire profession. Architecture is visual art, and he'd never once consciously appreciated that he could see. His mind. It could process complex calculations, hold multiple design concepts simultaneously, learn new software, remember conversations. And he'd spent most of his mental energy criticizing himself, replaying failures, anticipating disasters. The book suggested an exercise. Every evening, write down 3 specific things you're grateful for, not generic things. My family, my health. Be specific. The way my nephew laughed at my terrible joke yesterday. The fact that my knee didn't hurt when I climbed stairs today. Specificity creates presence. Daniel grabbed his notebook, the one he usually used for project notes, and flipped to a blank page. He dated it and wrote, "Things I'm grateful for today." He stared at the blank lines. This felt awkward, almost performative, but he committed to trying. 1. The way morning light fills this loft and makes the brick walls glow orange. I've seen this happen 1,000 times and never really looked at it until today. 2. Leo texting me yesterday. I've been so wrapped up in work that I've been a terrible friend. The fact that he still reaches out means I haven't completely destroyed that relationship yet. 3. The coffee I'm drinking right now. Someone grew these beans, harvested them, processed them, roasted them, packaged them, shipped them. Dozens of people's labor went into this simple cup, and it costs less than a movie ticket. That's remarkable. Writing those 3 things took maybe 90 seconds. But something happened in his chest as he wrote them. A small warmth, like someone had lit a candle in a room he'd thought was permanently dark. That evening, Daniel met Leo at a place called the Cornerstone, a pub they'd been going to since their university days. It had been, Daniel realized with shame, almost 3 months since they'd last hung out. Leo was already there, looking relaxed in a way Daniel envied. While Daniel had spent the last 9 months in architectural tunnel vision, Leo had built a career as a graphic designer that somehow managed to be both successful and sustainable. He worked hard, but he also surfed on weekends, took spontaneous road trips, had hobbies that had nothing to do with work. "You look different," Leo said as Daniel slid into the booth. "Different how?" "I don't know. Less wound up? What happened to you?" So Daniel told him about the presentation disaster, about Victoria's disappointment, about the book he'd stumbled across, about impermanence and gratitude, and feeling like his entire understanding of life was being quietly dismantled and rebuilt. Leo listened without interrupting, which was one of the things Daniel had always valued about him. When Daniel finished, Leo took a long drink of his beer and said, "Can I tell you something? And don't take this the wrong way." "Okay." "You've been miserable for years, like genuinely unhappy, and I don't think you even realized it." Daniel felt defensive for a moment, then let it go. "What do you mean?" "Every conversation we've had for the past 2 years has been about work stress, about deadlines and presentations and proving yourself. You stopped surfing with me because you didn't have time. You canceled on my birthday last year because of a project deadline. And whenever I'd ask if you were happy, you'd say, 'I'll be happy when this project is done,' or 'I'll be happy when I make senior architect,' or 'I'll be happy when I prove myself.'" Leo leaned forward. "Daniel, you've been living in the future for so long that you completely missed the present. And the present is where your actual life is happening." The words landed hard because they were true. Daniel had spent years treating the present moment as just the annoying obstacle between him and some future version of success. And in doing so, he'd missed everything. "So what changed?" Leo asked. "The presentation failed spectacularly, and I realized that all that control I thought I had, it was an illusion. I couldn't control the projector, couldn't control the investors' questions, couldn't control the outcome. And sitting with that, with my complete lack of control, it broke something open." "Broke open or broke free?" Daniel smiled. "Maybe both." They talked for 2 more hours. Real conversation, not the surface-level updates they'd been exchanging for months. Leo told him about a relationship that had ended, about doubts he was having about his career trajectory, about a trip to Japan he was planning. Daniel found himself actually present for it, actually listening, instead of waiting for his turn to talk about his own stress. When they finally left the pub, Leo said, "Do this more often. Not the drinking necessarily, but this. Being a person instead of a productivity machine." Walking home through the city streets, Daniel practiced something the book had mentioned, finding gratitude in real time. The evening was cool, but not cold. Grateful. His legs carried him without pain. Grateful. The city lights reflected in puddles from an earlier rain. Grateful. A street musician playing saxophone with genuine skill. Grateful. It felt almost absurd at first. This mental catalog of small appreciations. But by the time he reached his building, something had shifted. The evening didn't feel wasted because it wasn't productive. It felt valuable precisely because it was nothing but presence. Saturday morning, Daniel decided to do something he hadn't done in years. Go to the park. Not for exercise, not with a purpose, just to be there. Riverside Park was a 20-minute walk from his loft. It had a winding path along the water, massive oak trees, and benches that faced the river. Daniel found an empty bench and sat down, feeling slightly ridiculous. People came to parks for reasons, to jog, to walk dogs, to meet friends. He was just sitting. After about 10 minutes, an elderly man approached the bench. He was maybe 75, with silver hair and a weathered face that suggested a life well lived. He gestured to the empty spot beside Daniel. "Mind if I join you?" "Please," Daniel said. The man sat with a contented sigh. They sat in silence for a few minutes, both watching the river. Finally, the man spoke. "Beautiful morning." "It is," Daniel agreed. "I come here every Saturday. Have for 40 years. Same bench, same view. And you know what? It's different every single time." Daniel looked at the man with interest. "How so?" "The light changes. The season changes. The river level rises and falls. The trees grow taller, then eventually die and get replaced. Birds migrate through. People come and go. Even I change. I used to run this path. Then I walked it. Now I mostly sit and watch others enjoy it." He smiled. "Nothing stays the same, but that's what makes it worth noticing." Something about this man's presence felt significant. "I'm Daniel." "Thomas," the man said, extending his hand. His grip was firm but gentle. "You seem like you're working through something." Daniel laughed. "Is it that obvious? I've been alive long enough to recognize the look. What's on your mind?" And somehow, Daniel found himself telling this stranger about the presentation, the book, the sudden realization that he'd been living his entire adult life wrong. Thomas listened with the kind of attention that felt rare, no judgment, no advice waiting in the chamber, just presence. When Daniel finished, Thomas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Can I tell you about my life?" "Please." "I was a fisherman for 50 years. Started when I was 15, retired at 65. And for most of those years, I complained. The weather was too rough or too calm. The fish weren't biting. The equipment was too expensive. The regulations were too strict. My back hurt. My hands ached. I had 1,000 complaints." He paused, watching a jogger pass by. "Then one day, a storm hit while I was out on the water. Worst I'd ever seen. I genuinely thought I was going to die. The waves were 30 feet high, wind screaming, boat being tossed like a toy. I was terrified. But you made it back." "Barely. Took 6 hours to get to shore. Should have taken 40 minutes. When I finally stepped onto dry land, you know what I felt? Not relief, not triumph. Gratitude. Pure, overwhelming gratitude. For the land beneath my feet. For my boat that had held together. For my knowledge that had kept me alive. For every single thing I'd been complaining about for decades." Thomas turned to face Daniel directly. "That was 20 years ago. And since that day, I've tried to live like every morning might be my last one. Not in a morbid way, in a grateful way. Because the truth is, someday, it will be my last morning. And I don't want to waste whatever time I have left wishing things were different instead of appreciating what they are." Daniel felt something crack open in his chest. "How do you do it? How do you maintain that perspective?" "Practice," Thomas said simply. "Every morning I wake up and think, I get another day. Not, I have to face another day. I get another day. That reframe changes everything. They sat in silence for a while longer. Then Thomas stood, joints creaking. I should continue my walk. But Daniel, whatever you're going through, whatever you think you've lost or failed at, you're still here. You still get more days. What you do with them is up to you. As Thomas walked away, Daniel sat with those words. You still get more days. The Meridian Project had failed. That was true, but he had more days. Days to design new things, days to learn, days to appreciate morning light and river views and conversations with strangers who felt like teachers appearing exactly when needed. He pulled out his phone and opened his notes. Things I'm grateful for today. 1. Meeting Thomas, a complete stranger who reminded me that being alive is the baseline miracle and everything else is bonus. 2. This bench, this view, this moment. It's Saturday morning and I'm not working. A year ago, that would have felt like wasted time. Today, it feels like the most valuable hours I've spent in months. 3. The fact that my biggest problem right now is a failed work presentation, not hunger, not homelessness, not violence or illness or loss. My problem is professional disappointment. That means I have so much that I've been taking for granted. He sat there for another hour, just watching the river flow, watching people jog past, walk dogs, push strollers, hold hands, all of them living their temporary lives, experiencing their temporary moments. And for the first time in years, Daniel felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, contentment. Not because everything was perfect, but because he was finally noticing that everything included so much more than he'd been seeing. The book had one more section in the gratitude chapter that he read that night. Gratitude isn't about denying your struggles. It's not toxic positivity that pretends pain doesn't exist. Real gratitude is the practice of holding two truths simultaneously. Yes, this is hard, and yes, there is still beauty. Yes, I'm struggling, and yes, I still have things worth appreciating. Both can be true. Both usually are true. Daniel wrote one final note in his journal. The presentation failed. That hurt. It still hurts. I'm disappointed in myself and worried about my career. That's all true. And also, I have my health. I have friends who care. I have skills and creativity and potential. I live in a city full of possibility. I get to wake up tomorrow and try again. That's all true too. Maybe wisdom isn't choosing between these truths. Maybe it's learning to hold them both. He closed the journal and looked around his loft. Same space as always, but somehow it felt different, fuller, richer. Not because anything had changed, but because he was finally seeing what had always been there. Outside his window, the city hummed with Saturday night energy. Somewhere out there, people were celebrating and grieving, succeeding and failing, holding on and letting go. And all of it was temporary, precious, and worth noticing. Daniel smiled, picked up the book, and turned to the next chapter. He had a feeling the lessons were about to get harder. He was right. Section 3, The Courage to be Uncomfortable. Monday morning arrived with news that made Daniel's stomach drop. He was in the firm's kitchen area, making his second coffee of the day, when Victoria appeared beside him. She had that look, the professional but serious expression that meant This wasn't a casual conversation. Daniel, conference room in 10 minutes. The partners want to talk about Meridian. His heart rate spiked. About what specifically? The investors are giving us another chance. They want a revised pitch, 2 weeks from today. She paused, holding his gaze. And they specifically requested you to present it. Daniel's immediate reaction was a tidal wave of anxiety. His hands actually trembled slightly as he gripped his coffee mug. Every instinct screamed, run, decline, say you're not ready, pass it to someone else. But then he remembered Thomas on the park bench. He remembered the book's words about impermanence. And he thought about something he'd read just last night in the chapter he was about to start. Welcome discomfort, the doorway to becoming. I'll do it, he heard himself say. Victoria smiled, a real smile, not her professional one. Good, because I already told them yes on your behalf. I believe you're ready, Daniel. The question is whether you believe it. After she left, Daniel stood alone in the kitchen, his coffee cooling in his hands, wondering what he'd just agreed to. The exact scenario where he'd failed spectacularly was being handed back to him, amplified. More pressure, higher stakes, same stage where he'd collapsed. That night, instead of immediately diving into work prep, Daniel opened the book to the chapter he'd been avoiding. Welcome discomfort, the doorway to becoming. The opening lines felt personally targeted. Your body treats discomfort and danger as the same thing. That's why your heart races when you're about to give a speech, even though public speaking won't actually kill you. Your nervous system can't tell the difference between a hungry tiger and a challenging conversation. Both trigger the same alarm: threat, avoid, retreat. But here's the problem. Growth lives exclusively in the uncomfortable zone. Every skill you've ever learned, every strength you've developed, every version of yourself that's better than yesterday, all of it came from doing things that felt uncomfortable first. Daniel thought about learning to draft architectural plans. Those first few months had been excruciating. His hand cramping, his lines wobbly, his proportions all wrong. It had felt impossible, but he'd pushed through the discomfort, and eventually it became second nature. When had he stopped doing that? When had he stopped voluntarily entering discomfort? The book told a story about a young woman who dreamed of becoming a rock climber. She read every manual, watched every tutorial, bought the best equipment, but she never actually climbed, because standing at the base of even a small climbing wall, looking up at those holds, her hands would sweat and her breath would shorten and every cell in her body would scream, "Too scary, too hard, you'll fall." One day, an experienced climber noticed her at the gym, always watching, never trying. She approached and said something simple. "The fear you're feeling, that's not a stop sign. That's a signpost. It's literally pointing you toward growth." "But what if I fall?" the young woman asked. "You will fall. That's the whole point. The harness catches you. You learn that falling isn't fatal, and then you climb again, a little higher each time. The discomfort doesn't go away. You just change your relationship with it." The young woman finally clipped in and started climbing. Her arms shook, her legs trembled, every instinct wanted to quit. But she made it halfway up before her grip failed, and she fell. The harness caught her, exactly as promised. "How do you feel?" the experienced climber called up. The young woman hung there, suspended, breathing hard, and then she laughed. Terrified, but also alive. Can I try again? The book's point was clear. Discomfort isn't the enemy. Avoidance of discomfort is. Daniel set the book down and made a decision. If he was going to face this presentation again, he wasn't going to do it the old way, trying to control everything, rehearsing until it was mechanical, treating it like a performance instead of a conversation. He was going to do it uncomfortable. But first, he needed to practice being uncomfortable in smaller ways. The book suggested exactly that. Train your nervous system. Do one thing every day that makes you uncomfortable, not dangerous, uncomfortable. Cold shower, different route to work, conversation you've been avoiding. Start small, build the muscle. The next morning, Daniel stood in his shower, hand on the temperature knob, having a debate with himself. This is stupid. You're voluntarily choosing to be cold. Why? Because comfort is a cage, and I've been living in it for years. He turned the knob all the way to cold and stepped under the spray before he could change his mind. The shock was intense. His body seized up. His breath came in gasps. Every nerve ending screamed at him to get out. For 30 seconds, it was genuinely awful. Then something shifted. His breathing regulated. His body adapted. The cold water stopped feeling like an assault and started feeling like clarity, intensity, proof that he could choose discomfort and survive it. When he stepped out 3 minutes later, he felt electric, awake in a way that coffee never achieved, and more importantly, he felt proud. He'd done something uncomfortable by choice, small victory, but it mattered. At work, Daniel implemented the second uncomfortable practice, speaking up first in meetings. Usually, he'd wait, gauge the room, see what direction the conversation was heading, offer safe, agreeable input. But in the morning project review, when Victoria asked for initial thoughts on the revised Meridian approach, Daniel raised his hand before anyone else could speak. I think we need to completely reconceptualize the presentation format. Last time, we tried to dazzle them with data, but what they actually want is to understand our why this project matters beyond profit margins, why sustainable housing isn't just good ethics, but good business. The room went quiet. Daniel's palms were sweating. His colleague James was probably about to disagree. Victoria might think he was overstepping. But Victoria leaned forward. Go on. And suddenly, the conversation exploded with energy. His idea sparked others. The team built on his suggestion, creating something better than he could have done alone, all because he'd been willing to feel uncomfortable by speaking first. After the meeting, Leo texted, "Lunch? Need to hear about this mysterious transformation." They met at a small Vietnamese place near the firm. Over PHO, Daniel told Leo about the cold showers, the speaking first strategy, the deliberate discomfort practice. Leo laughed. "You're actually doing this? The guy who meal prepped every Sunday for 3 years to avoid the discomfort of deciding what to eat? That guy is exactly why I need to do this. I've spent my entire adult life optimizing for comfort, and it's made me fragile. The moment anything goes wrong, I shatter. So now you're what, becoming a Navy SEAL? No, I'm just trying to prove to myself that I can handle discomfort, that it won't kill me, because The presentation is coming, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and I can't run from it. Leo's expression shifted to something more serious. Can I try something with you? Okay. Right now, tell that woman at the next table that her jacket is beautiful. Daniel felt his stomach clench. What? Why? Because it's uncomfortable. Because you're scared of looking weird or being rejected. Because it's a tiny act of social courage that costs you nothing, but feels risky. Daniel looked over at the woman. She was maybe 40, wearing a vintage leather jacket with intricate embroidery. It genuinely was beautiful, but the thought of just walking up to a stranger, discomfort is the doorway. He stood up before he could overthink it, walked to her table and said, "Excuse me, I'm sorry to interrupt, but that jacket is stunning. The embroidery work is incredible." The woman's face lit up. "Thank you. I got it at a vintage market in Portland. You just made my day." Daniel returned to his table, heart pounding like he'd just sprinted a mile. Leo was grinning. "How do you feel?" "Terrified, but also good, like I just proved something to myself." "That's the point. You didn't die. She didn't call security. You gave someone a genuine compliment, and they appreciated it. The discomfort was all in your head." Over the next week, Daniel committed fully to the discomfort practice. Each day brought a new small challenge. Tuesday, took a completely different route to work, got slightly lost, asked a stranger for directions, felt uncomfortable, survived. Wednesday, called his sister Elena, who he hadn't spoken to in 2 months, had a real conversation, admitted he'd been distant because work had consumed him. She admitted she'd been hurt by it, uncomfortable honesty, stronger relationship. Thursday, tried a dance class that Leo had been inviting him to for years, was terrible at it, felt foolish, laughed at himself, stayed for the whole hour, felt alive. Friday, wore a bright yellow shirt to work instead of his usual grays and blues, felt conspicuous, received 3 compliments, realized his fear of standing out was just fear, not fact. Each small act of discomfort was teaching his nervous system a crucial lesson. This feeling isn't danger, it's just unfamiliarity, and unfamiliarity is where growth lives. But the real test was coming. The presentation was now 1 week away. Daniel approached it differently this time. Instead of rehearsing a script, he practiced having conversations. He'd grab colleagues and say, "Pitch me on why sustainable housing matters in 15 seconds. He'd time himself explaining complex concepts simply. He'd deliberately introduce technical glitches during practice runs to train himself to adapt. Victoria noticed the change. "You're preparing differently this time." "Last time I tried to control everything. This time I'm training myself to handle anything." "Smart. But are you ready for the psychological part? Margaret Chin will be there again. She'll remember your last presentation. How are you going to handle that?" Daniel had been avoiding thinking about that. The embarrassment of facing the same people who'd watched him fail. The humiliation of getting a second chance, which somehow felt worse than just failing and moving on. Honestly, I don't know. That part still terrifies me. "Good," Victoria said. "Fear means you care. Just don't let it paralyze you." 3 days before the presentation, Daniel had a moment of crisis. He was in his loft, running through his opening for the 20th time, when suddenly his throat closed up. His mind went blank. The old panic flooded back, and with it, a voice. You're going to fail again, just like before, maybe worse. He sat down hard on his couch, head in his hands. For a moment, he genuinely considered it, calling Victoria, saying he was sick, finding any escape route from this discomfort. Then he remembered something Thomas had said in the park. You still get more days. And something from the book. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's taking action despite fear. Daniel picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done before. He called Leo. I'm panicking, he said when Leo answered. The presentation is in 3 days and I'm convinced I'm going to fail. Okay, Leo said calmly. So let's say you do fail. Worst case scenario. What happens? I humiliate myself again, probably lose my shot at future projects, maybe even my job. And then, I don't know. I'd have to find another firm, I guess. Would that kill you? Daniel paused. No. Would it end your ability to be an architect? No. Would it mean you're worthless as a human? No, but Daniel, I'm not minimizing this. I know it matters to you. But you're treating this presentation like it's a referendum on your entire existence. It's not. It's a work presentation. You'll either do well or you won't. And either way, the sun will rise the next day, and you'll still be you. Something in Daniel's chest loosened. When did you get so wise? I've always been this wise. You've just been too stressed to notice. That conversation shifted something. The presentation was still important. It still mattered. But it wasn't everything. It was just one moment in a much longer story. The morning of the presentation, Daniel did his cold shower, 5 minutes this time. He wore a suit that felt slightly too bold for his usual style. He arrived early, and instead of obsessively checking his slides, he sat in the conference room alone, just breathing. At 10 a.m., the investors filed in. Margaret Chen was there, her sharp eyes immediately finding Daniel. He met her gaze and nodded. No apology, no defensiveness, just acknowledgement. I'm here. I'm ready. Let's do this. Victoria introduced him. Daniel stood, felt his heart pounding, felt his palms sweating, felt every uncomfortable sensation of fear and adrenaline and vulnerability. And he began. Thank you for giving us another chance. Last time I was here, I tried to impress you with data and technical specifications. Today, I want to have a conversation about why this project matters. He clicked to his first slide. Not a graph or a rendering, but a photograph of a family standing outside a cramped, deteriorating apartment building. This is the Rodriguez family, 3 generations living in 800 square feet. Their building has black mold, faulty wiring, and heating that fails every winter. They're not an anomaly. They're representative of 40% of urban families in this city. Margaret Chen leaned forward slightly. Daniel noticed, but didn't let it throw him. The Meridian Project isn't just about sustainable architecture or profit margins. It's about dignified housing, about families like the Rodriguezes having spaces that don't just shelter them, but honor them. He moved through his presentation, but it felt different this time. When the projector briefly glitched, a moment that would have destroyed him before, he simply smiled and said, Technology keeps us humble. Let me paint the picture verbally while that resets. When Margaret interrupted with a challenging question, instead of panicking, he paused, thought, and said, "That's a critical question. Let me think about the best way to address it." He wasn't perfect. His voice wavered slightly at one point. He stumbled over a transition, but he was present. He was authentic. He was having a conversation rather than performing a script. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. Then Margaret Chen spoke. "Mr. Torres, that was substantially different from your previous presentation." Daniel's heart sank. Different could mean worse. But then she continued, "Last time, you tried to show us you knew everything. Today, you showed us you understand what matters. That's what we needed to see." The meeting continued for another 30 minutes. Questions, discussions, negotiations. But the tone had shifted. They were talking like partners, not adversaries. When everyone finally left, Victoria found Daniel in the hallway. He was leaning against the wall, exhausted but exhilarated. "You did it," she said simply. "I did it scared," Daniel replied. "I was terrified the whole time." "I know. That's what made it work. You were real. Last time you were performing. Today you were present." That night, Daniel wrote in his journal, "Today, I learned that courage isn't feeling brave. It's feeling terrified and doing it anyway. It's welcoming the discomfort as proof that I'm growing, not as evidence that I'm failing. The cold showers were never about the water. The social challenges were never about the specific actions. They were all about training myself to recognize this truth. Discomfort is temporary, but growth is permanent. Fear is just a feeling, but avoidance is a choice. I'm still scared of things. Probably always will be. But now I know that scared doesn't mean stop. It means pay attention. It means you're about to learn something." He closed the journal and looked around his loft. Same space, but he was different in it, stronger. Not because life had gotten easier, but because he'd learned to do hard things. Outside his window, the city continued its endless rhythm. Somewhere out there, people were facing their own fears, doing their own uncomfortable things, learning their own lessons about courage. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, felt like he was actually living instead of just surviving. But he was about to learn that knowing how to face discomfort was one thing. Knowing when to stop fighting and let go was something else entirely. That lesson was coming, and it would break him open in ways he couldn't yet imagine. Section 4. The Art of Surrender. 3 weeks after the successful presentation, Daniel's life was finally starting to feel stable. The investors had approved the Meridian project with significant funding. Victoria had hinted at a promotion. His friendship with Leo had deepened through their regular meetups. He was still practicing his daily discomfort challenges, still writing his gratitude lists, still learning. He thought he'd figured it out, thought he'd cracked the code. Then his phone rang at 4:37 a.m. on a Wednesday. Daniel jerked awake, heart already pounding. Nothing good ever came from pre-dawn phone calls. He fumbled for his phone and saw his sister's name. "Elena?" "Daniel." Her voice was shaking. "It's Mom. She had a heart episode. We're at St. Catherine's Medical Center. You need to come now." The drive to the hospital passed in a blur of streetlights and racing thoughts. His mother, vibrant, healthy, always moving Maria Torres, was in the emergency room. It didn't make sense. She was only 62. She did yoga. She ate well. This wasn't supposed to happen. At the hospital, Elena was in the waiting area with their father, Roberto. Elena's eyes were red from crying. Their father looked 10 years older than he had last week. "What happened?" Daniel asked, embracing them both. "She collapsed at home," Roberto said, his voice hollow. One moment she was making breakfast, the next she was on the floor. The paramedics said it was a severe arrhythmia. Her heart was beating irregularly, not pumping blood properly. "Is she?" "She's stable now. They've got her on medication and monitoring. But Daniel," his father's voice cracked, "they said this is serious. She'll need surgery, maybe a pacemaker, and recovery will be long." A doctor emerged and took them to a small consultation room. She was kind, but direct. Maria's heart condition was more advanced than they'd realized. She'd probably been having small episodes for months, but had ignored them, chalking them up to stress or fatigue. "The surgery has good success rates," the doctor explained, "but recovery will require significant lifestyle changes, no stress, modified activity, constant monitoring. Your mother's life is going to look very different for a while." Over the next 72 hours, Daniel barely left the hospital. He took emergency leave from work. He slept in uncomfortable chairs. He brought his father coffee and made sure Elena ate. He held his mother's hand when she was awake enough to squeeze back. And through all of it, he felt something he'd been working so hard to overcome, the desperate need to control things that were completely beyond his control. He wanted to fix this, wanted to research every treatment option, consult with specialists, create a recovery plan, build a structure around this chaos. But there was nothing to build, no blueprint for making your mother's heart heal faster, no architectural solution to fear and helplessness. On the fourth day, while his mother was stable but sleeping, Daniel found himself in the hospital's small chapel. He wasn't particularly religious, but he needed somewhere quiet to sit with the weight of everything. He pulled out his phone and opened the book app, scrolling to the chapter he'd been avoiding. Know when to let go, the wisdom of release. The opening lines felt brutally timed. We spend our lives trying to hold on to things that were never meant to be permanent. Relationships that have run their course, jobs that no longer serve us, versions of ourselves that we've outgrown, ideas about how life is supposed to go, and the tighter we grip, the more we suffer. Daniel felt anger flash through him. Easy to say when it's abstract, harder when it's your mother in a hospital bed. But he kept reading. Letting go doesn't mean you don't care. It doesn't mean giving up. It means recognizing that some things are beyond your control, and that fighting against that truth creates suffering that serves no fun. The book told a story about a woman whose son was deployed overseas in a war zone. Every day she was consumed by fear. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, spent hours watching news coverage, trying to control the uncontrollable through information gathering and worry. One day, her friend, whose own son had served and returned, said something that changed everything. "You're suffering twice, once in your imagination of what might happen, and potentially again if it actually does. But your suffering now doesn't protect him. It doesn't change anything except your own well-being. And if he does come home, Don't you want to be whole enough to be present with him? The woman realized she'd been treating her worry like a form of love, like if she just feared hard enough, cared intensely enough, that would somehow keep him safe. But it was an illusion. Her son's safety had nothing to do with her anxiety level. So she made a radical choice. She let go, not of loving him, not of hoping for his safety, but of the belief that her worry served any purpose. She started living again, and when her son did return home 6 months later, she was healthy enough to actually be there for him. Daniel set his phone down and stared at the simple wooden cross on the chapel wall. He'd been doing the same thing with his mother, spending every moment trying to control the uncontrollable, researching obsessively, planning her recovery before doctors even had a full diagnosis, treating his anxiety like productive action when it was really just suffering dressed up as care. His mother was in the ICU. He couldn't change that. The surgery would happen or it wouldn't. She would recover or she wouldn't. And none of that depended on how tightly he gripped his fear. What he could control was how he showed up, whether he was present or just physically there while mentally spiraling, whether he used this time to actually connect with his family or just to marinate in anxiety. He pulled out his journal. He'd been bringing it everywhere lately and wrote, "I can't control whether Mom's surgery succeeds. I can't control how long her recovery takes. I can't control whether this changes her life permanently. Accepting this doesn't mean I don't love her. It means I love her enough to be actually present instead of consumed by the illusion that worry equals care. What I can control? Being here, telling her I love her, supporting Dad and Elena, taking care of myself so I can take care of them. That's enough. That has to be enough." His mother's surgery was scheduled for the following Monday. The weekend before felt surreal, waiting, existing in limbo, trying to maintain normalcy while knowing everything could change. Sunday afternoon, Leo showed up at Daniel's loft with takeout and a deliberate lack of pity. "Thought you might need food and company," he said, unpacking containers of Thai food. "Thanks," Daniel said, realizing he couldn't remember the last real meal he'd eaten. They ate in silence for a few minutes. Then Leo said, "How are you actually doing? And don't give me the 'I'm fine' response." Daniel set down his fork. "Honestly, I'm terrified, and I feel completely powerless, and I hate it." "Of course you do. Your mom's in the hospital. That's nightmare territory. But I've been learning all these things, right? About acceptance and letting go and embracing uncertainty. And I thought I'd gotten somewhere. But the moment real crisis hits, I'm right back to wanting to control everything." Leo shook his head. "That's not failure, man. That's being human. You're not supposed to be some enlightened master who faces his mom's heart surgery with perfect Zen acceptance. You're supposed to be scared. The question is whether you let that fear paralyze you or whether you feel it and still show up. I don't know how to just let go. How do you release control when the stakes are this high? You already know how. You did it with the presentation. You prepared, then you surrendered to whatever would happen. This is the same thing, just with stakes that actually matter." That night, Daniel returned to the book. The chapter on letting go had a section he'd skipped before, the serenity practice. It outlined a simple framework. For everything that's causing you stress, ask 3 questions. Can I control this? Honestly assess. If yes, take action. Do what's in your power. If no, practice release. Accept what is. Daniel grabbed his journal and made 2 lists. What I can control. Being present at the hospital. Taking care of practical needs. Dad's meals, Elena's support. Maintaining my own health so I can help others. Expressing love to Mom while she can hear it. Researching post-surgery care plans, what I cannot control. Whether the surgery succeeds, how long recovery takes. Whether Mom's life changes permanently. The outcome of her condition. The fear I feel looking at it laid out like that. The division was stark. And he realized he'd been spending 90% of his mental energy on the bottom list, the things he literally couldn't control, and maybe 10% on the top list. What if he reversed that? Monday morning arrived too quickly and too slowly at the same time. The surgery was scheduled for 8 a.m. Daniel, Elena, and Roberto sat in the surgical waiting room, each processing fear in their own way. Daniel had brought a book, not the self-help one, just a novel he'd been meaning to read for years, and he actually read it. Not because he didn't care about the surgery, but because sitting there running disaster, scenarios in his mind for 4 hours wouldn't change anything except his own suffering. Elena noticed. How are you so calm? I'm not calm. I'm terrified, but I'm trying to let the fear exist without letting it consume me. Does that make sense? She thought about it. Actually, yeah. I've been imagining every worst-case scenario on repeat. Like, if I just worry hard enough, I can somehow prevent bad outcomes. I know. I was doing the same thing, but it doesn't work like that. Roberto, who'd been quiet all morning, spoke up. Your mother would tell us the same thing. She's always saying, Roberto, worry is interest paid on a debt you haven't incurred yet. They all smiled at that. It was such a Maria thing to say. 4 hours later, the surgeon emerged. Her expression was carefully neutral, and Daniel's heart seized. Then she smiled. The surgery went well. Better than expected, actually. She's in recovery now. You'll be able to see her in about an hour. The relief was physical. Elena burst into tears. Roberto's shoulders sagged as tension released. Daniel felt like he might collapse. But underneath the relief was something else. The recognition that they'd just survived hours of absolutely no control, and they'd survived it together. When they finally saw Maria, she was groggy, but smiling. Did I miss anything exciting? Just the entire hospital staff falling in love with you, Daniel said, squeezing her hand. They said the surgery went well, she murmured, but the recovery, it's going to be long. Lifestyle changes. I can't just bounce back to normal. Then we adapt, Roberto said firmly, whatever that looks like. Over the next week, as Maria stabilized and began the slow process of recovery, Daniel found himself applying the letting go practice to smaller things too. He'd been clinging to a vision of himself as someone who always had answers, who never showed weakness, who controlled outcomes through sheer force of will. But watching his mother in physical therapy, struggling to walk 20 feet without getting winded, he saw what real strength looked like. It was accepting help, admitting limitations, doing hard things slowly instead of pretending they weren't hard. 2 weeks after the surgery, Daniel was back at work part-time. Victoria, had been incredibly understanding, but there was a backlog of Meridian project decisions that needed his input. In a team meeting, his colleague James proposed a significant design change, one that would alter a core aspect of Daniel's original vision for the project. Old Daniel would have fought it, would have defended his original concept, because letting it change felt like admitting it was wrong. But this Daniel listened to James's reasoning, recognized it was actually an improvement, and said, "You're right. That's better than my original idea. Let's go with it." The room went quiet for a moment. James actually looked surprised. "Really? You're okay with changing that?" "The goal is the best possible building, not protecting my ego. If your idea serves the goal better, we should use it." After the meeting, Victoria pulled him aside. "What's happened to you?" "What do you mean?" "A month ago, you would have died on that hill. You would have defended your original concept like it was sacred, but you just let it go." Daniel thought about how to explain it. "I'm learning that holding on to things too tightly, ideas control outcomes, it doesn't make them better. It just makes me more brittle, and I'd rather be flexible than broken." That weekend, Daniel did something he'd been avoiding. He went through his loft and got rid of things. Not randomly, intentionally. He looked at everything with fresh eyes. Does this serve me now? Or am I keeping it because of who I used to be or who I thought I'd become? The color-coded schedules from his hyper-controlled phase? Recycled. The books on optimization and productivity that had made him feel like human worth was measurable in output? Donated. The expensive espresso machine he'd bought to make perfect coffee and then stressed over maintaining? Given to Leo, who'd actually enjoy it? Clothes he'd kept for years just in case? Charity. With each thing he released, the space felt lighter. Not empty, lighter. Like he was making room for who he was becoming instead of who he'd been trying to be. He took a photo of his newly simplified space and sent it to Leo. "Letting go of things I've been carrying that no longer serve me." Leo's response, "Proud of you, man. That's harder than it looks." Sunday evening, Daniel visited his parents. His mother was home now, moving slowly but steadily improving. She was sitting in her favorite chair, wrapped in a blanket, looking smaller than he'd ever seen her, but also somehow more present. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Tired. Frustrated that I can't do everything I used to, but also—" She paused, searching for words. "Grateful." This scared me into realizing I'd been taking my health for granted, taking time for granted. I thought I had infinite tomorrows. Now I know better. Daniel sat beside her. "Can I tell you something?" "Always." "Watching you go through this has taught me more than any book or lesson could. You're accepting help. You're letting go of your old pace and learning a new one. You're not fighting against reality. You're working with it. That's the bravest thing I've ever seen." Maria's eyes filled with tears. "I don't feel brave. I feel scared and diminished." Bravery isn't not feeling scared. It's feeling scared and still showing up, still trying, still choosing presence over bitterness. She squeezed his hand. "When did you get so wise?" "I had a good teacher," he said, squeezing back. That night, Daniel wrote what would become one of his most important journal entries. Letting go isn't giving up. It's making space. It's saying, "I did what I could with what I had, and now I'm releasing my grip on the outcome. Mom's surgery. I couldn't control it, but I could control how I showed up. That was enough. The Meridian Project changes. I couldn't control other people's ideas, but I could control whether I stayed flexible enough to recognize when they were right. That was enough. My need to be perfect, I'm letting it go. Not because I'm settling for less, but because perfection is a prison and I'd rather be free. This is the paradox. The more I try to control, the less control I have. The more I let go, the more power I reclaim. Not power over outcomes, but power over my own experience, my own peace, my own growth. I'm learning that strength isn't about how tightly you can hold on. It's about knowing when to open your hands. He closed the journal and looked around his simplified loft. Through the window, he could see the city lights, thousands of lives being lived, each person holding on to some things and trying to let go of others. Daniel felt different, not fixed. He'd never be finished growing, but different, lighter, like he'd been carrying weight he didn't need and had finally set it down. His phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. Meridian presentation to the City Council next month. You're leading it. Thought you should know. Old Daniel would have immediately felt anxiety, would have started planning obsessively, would have gripped this new opportunity so tightly he'd strangle it. This Daniel just smiled and typed back, "Looking forward to it." Then he put his phone down, made himself tea, and sat by the window, just being present, just being here, just being enough. Because he was learning that life wasn't about controlling the waves, it was about learning to surf them. And sometimes the bravest thing you could do was let go of the shore and trust yourself to stay afloat. The hardest lesson was still coming, but he was ready for it, or at least ready to face it imperfectly, which was the only way any of us ever are. Section 5. The Ripple Effect. 6 months had passed since Daniel's world had cracked open with a failed presentation and rebuilt itself through lessons he never expected to learn. 6 months of cold showers and uncomfortable conversations. 6 months of gratitude lists and letting go. 6 months of watching his mother slowly recover and learning what resilience actually looked like. But the biggest lesson was still waiting for him, hidden in plain sight. And it would arrive disguised as tragedy. It was a gray Tuesday in November when Victoria called him into her office with news that made his stomach drop. Not for himself this time, but for someone else. "Have you heard about the Riverside Community Project?" she asked. Daniel nodded. It was an initiative he'd been passionate about, a proposal to convert an abandoned factory into mixed-use affordable housing and community spaces. He'd volunteered dozens of hours on the design, working with neighborhood advocates and local artists. Itakea wasn't a paid gig, just something that mattered. "The funding fell through," Victoria said quietly. "The primary donor backed out this morning. The project is dead." Daniel felt the news land, but differently than he would have 6 months ago. There was disappointment, yes, sadness, but not devastation, not the world-ending collapse he would have experienced before. "That's awful," he said. "Those families were counting on it. The neighborhood was counting on it. I know, I'm sorry. I know how much time you put into it." After leaving her office, Daniel walked to Riverside Park, the same place where he'd met Thomas months ago. He needed to think, to process, to sit with this disappointment. The park was nearly empty on this cold weekday morning. Daniel found his usual bench and sat, watching the river flow past, gray and steady and indifferent to human plans. He pulled out his phone and opened the book to the final chapter he'd been saving. View difficulties as opportunities. The alchemy of adversity. The opening line was confrontational. This is the lesson that sounds like toxic positivity, until you actually understand it. I'm not asking you to be grateful for suffering. I'm asking you to recognize that within difficulty exists potential for growth that wouldn't be available any other way. Daniel read on. The chapter told a story about a master potter whose workshop burned down. Everything was destroyed. Years of work, irreplaceable pieces, all his tools and materials. He stood in the ashes, devastated, certain his career was over. But as he sifted through the rubble, he found something unexpected. Some of his pottery had been in the kiln when the fire hit, and the extreme heat had created effects he'd never been able to achieve intentionally. The glazes had melted and reformed in stunning, unrepeatable patterns. The pieces were unlike anything he'd ever created, more beautiful because they'd been forged in disaster. He realized something profound. The fire hadn't just destroyed his old work. It had revealed new possibilities he would never have explored otherwise. He rebuilt his workshop, but he rebuilt it differently, with better ventilation, more efficient workspace, incorporating lessons from the loss. And his new work, influenced by those accidental fire-created pieces, became the most acclaimed of his career. The story ended with a question. What if your difficulties aren't obstacles to your growth, but the very mechanism of it? Daniel sat with that for a long time, watching the river. The Riverside Project was dead. That was true. Families who needed housing would have to wait longer. That was also true. But what else might be true? He pulled out his journal and started writing, not with bitterness, but with genuine curiosity. What is this difficulty teaching me? The Riverside Project failing is teaching me that impact isn't always linear, that sometimes you pour yourself into something that doesn't happen, and that's not wasted. It's practice. It's relationship building. It's learning what matters. It's teaching me that I can care deeply about something and survive its failure, that my worth isn't tied to whether every project succeeds. It's teaching me about resilience in communities. The same people who worked on Riverside are already talking about what's next. They're not quitting. They're adapting. That's the real lesson. As he wrote, Daniel noticed someone approaching, an older man walking slowly with a cane. Thomas, the fisherman from months ago. "Mind if I join you?" Thomas asked with a smile of recognition. "Please, I was hoping I'd run into you again." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Thomas said, "You look different than last time, more settled, but something's bothering you today." Daniel told him about the Riverside Project, about the months of work that had just evaporated. Thomas listened with the same patient attention he'd shown before. "You know what I learned in 50 years of fishing," Thomas finally said. "The days when you catch nothing are often the most valuable, because those are the days you have to question everything, your technique, your location, your assumptions. The easy catches don't teach you much. The failures, those are where wisdom lives." So I should be grateful the project failed? No. You should be honest that it hurts, and also honest about what you're learning from it. Both can be true. Daniel nodded slowly. I'm learning I can survive disappointment. I'm learning that caring about something and having it fail doesn't mean I was wrong to care. I'm learning that impact happens in ways I can't always see or measure. Sounds like valuable lessons. But the families who needed that housing still need it, Thomas finished. And maybe your next attempt, informed by what you learned from this one, will serve them better. Or maybe someone else will solve it differently. The need doesn't disappear because one solution failed, but you're more capable now than you were 6 months ago, aren't you? Daniel realized he was significantly more capable, not because everything had gone perfectly, but precisely because it hadn't. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. The people who'd worked on the Riverside project started meeting informally, not to mourn what didn't happen, but to strategize what could happen next. Daniel found himself at a community center one evening, surrounded by architects, social workers, neighborhood advocates, and former factory workers. The energy in the room was different from the official planning meetings. More grassroots, more real. A woman named Carmen, who'd lived in the neighborhood for 40 years, stood up. I'm tired of waiting for some big donor to save us. What if we did this differently, smaller, more community-led? The conversation that followed was electric. Ideas bounced around the room. Microloans, cooperative ownership, phased development, partnerships with local trade schools for construction training. Daniel found himself sketching on napkins, his architectural training synthesizing with the lived expertise in the room. This wasn't the grand vision he'd designed before. It was smaller, scrappier, more complex. It was also more real, more possible, more aligned with what the community actually needed rather than what looked good in a presentation. By the end of the evening, they had the skeleton of a new plan. Not a replacement for Riverside, something different entirely. Something that wouldn't have existed if the original project had succeeded. Walking home that night, Daniel understood what the book had meant about difficulties as opportunities. The Riverside project failing had forced them to be more creative, more collaborative, more grounded in community needs. The failure had actually been a redirection, but the most profound opportunity was still coming. A week later, Leo called. Remember that dance class you came to once? The instructor wants to start a workshop series on using movement to process difficult emotions. Thought of you immediately. Why me? I'm terrible at dancing. Exactly. You're terrible at dancing, but you came anyway. That's the kind of vulnerability she's looking for. People who are willing to be bad at things in service of growth. Daniel almost said no. Almost fell back into the old pattern of staying in his lane, doing what he was good at, avoiding spaces where he might look foolish. But then he thought about everything he'd learned, about discomfort as a doorway, about growth living outside the comfort zone. Okay, I'll do it. The workshop was small, 8 people in a community center studio. The instructor, a woman named Yara, had them start with a simple exercise. Move your body in a way that expresses how you're feeling right now. Daniel felt ridiculous. He was an architect, not a dancer. His body was good at sitting at drafting tables and walking purposefully, not this. but he closed his eyes and tried, moved his arms in a gesture that felt like carrying weight, then releasing it, bent low like collapsing, then slowly rose like rebuilding. When he opened his eyes, he noticed others were watching, not with judgment, with recognition. After the exercise, people shared. A woman named Jasmine talked about losing her job. A man named Marcus described his father's dementia. A younger person named River spoke about coming out to unsupportive parents. Each story was different. Each was difficult. And each was met with honest presence rather than toxic positivity. When it was Daniel's turn, he talked about the failed presentation that had started everything, about his mother's heart surgery, about learning to let go of control, about the Riverside Project. The weirdest thing, he said, is that the worst 6 months of my life have also been the most important. I wouldn't wish any of it on anyone, but I also wouldn't trade what I've learned. Jasmine nodded vigorously. That's exactly it. The difficulty is real. The growth is also real. Both are true. Over the following weeks, something beautiful emerged from that workshop. The participants started meeting outside the formal sessions for coffee, for walks, just to check in. Daniel found himself in a community of people who understood something crucial. That transformation often comes wrapped in difficulty, and that sharing the journey makes it bearable. One evening, Marcus, the man dealing with his father's dementia, asked Daniel, "How did you actually change? Like, what was the mechanism?" Daniel thought about it. "Honestly, I read a book, made some uncomfortable choices, started practicing gratitude, learned to let go. But the real change was deciding that who I'd been wasn't who I had to stay being." Could you teach that? Like, actually teach it? The idea planted itself and grew. Within a month, Daniel had been asked to facilitate a session at the community center, a workshop called When Things Don't Go Your Way, Finding Meaning in Difficulty. The night of the workshop, Daniel stood in front of 30 people, his hands shaking, his mouth dry. Every instinct screamed at him to run. But he thought about Thomas, about his mother's courage during recovery, about everyone who'd shown him that strength meant showing up scared. He began. "Hi, I'm Daniel. I'm an architect, which means I'm professionally trained to control outcomes through careful planning, and I'm here to tell you that everything I thought I knew about control was wrong." He saw people lean forward, saw recognition in their eyes. 6 months ago, I gave the worst presentation of my career, absolutely bombed, and in that failure, something cracked open. I realized I'd been living my entire life like if I just planned well enough, worked hard enough, controlled tightly enough, I could avoid difficulty. But that's not how life works. He shared his journey, not as a guru with answers, but as someone still figuring it out. He talked about impermanence and gratitude, about facing discomfort and learning to let go, about viewing difficulties as teachers rather than enemies. "I'm not going to tell you that everything happens for a reason," he said. "I don't believe that. Bad things happen randomly. But I do believe we can choose what we do with difficulty. We can let it break us apart or break us open. Both are options. Both are understandable." After his presentation, people shared their own stories. A woman dealing with divorce, a man whose business had failed, a student struggling with chronic illness, a parent whose child was in rehab. Each story was unique. Each was hard, and each was met with genuine presence. Afterward, a younger woman approached him. "Thank you. Everyone keeps telling me to stay positive about my diagnosis, but you said it's okay for this to be hard. That helped more than you know." An older man shook his hand. "I've been bitter about my company laying me off for 2 years, but what you said about letting go, I'm going to think about that." Walking home that night, Daniel felt something profound. His transformation wasn't just personal anymore. It was creating permission for others to transform too. Not because he was perfect or had all the answers, but precisely because he was honest about still figuring it out. The book had been right. Sharing your light doesn't mean being enlightened. It means being authentic. Over the next few months, Daniel's life settled into a new rhythm. Not the rigid, controlled routine of before, but something more flexible. He still did his cold showers. They'd become non-negotiable. He still wrote his gratitude lists. He still sought out discomfort intentionally. But he also made space for spontaneity, for last-minute plans with Leo, for long dinners with his recovering mother, for community work that didn't advance his career but fed his soul. The Meridian Project launched successfully. The community-led housing initiative was gaining traction. His workshop had become a monthly event. His relationship with Victoria had evolved into genuine mentorship. One Sunday afternoon, Daniel was at his parents' house for dinner. His mother was moving almost normally now, though she tired more easily. But the experience had changed her. She was more present, more appreciative, more willing to accept help. "You seem different," she said as they prepared salad together. "Different how?" "Lighter, like you put down something heavy." Daniel smiled. "I have. I put down the belief that I could control everything, that my worth was measured by my productivity, that failure meant I was fundamentally flawed." "And what did you pick up instead?" He thought about it. "Presence, I guess. The ability to be here right now, instead of always living in the future or the past. The understanding that life is going to be difficult sometimes, and that's not a bug, it's a feature." Maria squeezed his hand. "I'm proud of who you're becoming." That night, Daniel wrote what would be his final journal entry for this chapter of his life. "A year ago, I thought transformation was about becoming perfect, about eliminating all weakness, controlling all outcomes, achieving constant success. Now I know that transformation is about becoming real, about accepting imperfection, releasing control, learning from failure. I've learned that nothing lasts, not the good, not the bad. Everything is temporary, and that's not sad. That's liberating. I've learned that gratitude isn't about denying struggle. It's about recognizing beauty alongside struggle. I've learned that discomfort is the doorway to growth, and that courage means doing things scared. I've learned that letting go isn't giving up. It's making space for what's next. I've learned that difficulties aren't obstacles to a meaningful life. They're how meaning gets forged. And I've learned that transformation isn't meant to be hoarded. It's meant to be shared, not by preaching, but by living, by being honest about the struggle and the growth happening simultaneously. This isn't the end of my journey. I'll keep learning, keep failing, keep growing. But I'm different now, not fixed, different, and that's enough. 6 months later, Daniel stood in front of a larger audience at a TEDx event. The title of his talk, The Architecture of Becoming: What Buildings Taught Me About Personal Transformation. His hand still shook as he took the stage. His mouth was still dry, but he smiled at the discomfort, recognizing it as an old friend that meant he was about to grow. "I'm an architect," he began. "I design buildings, but the most important structure I've ever worked on is myself. And let me tell you, I am very much still under construction." The audience laughed. He relaxed. "A year ago, I would have told you that a good life is one without difficulty. Now I know that a good life is one where you meet difficulty with courage, curiosity, and a willingness to be transformed by it." As he spoke, he saw people nodding, saw recognition in their eyes, saw the same hunger for authentic wisdom that he'd felt when he first picked up that book. And he understood. His light, imperfect, flickering, still finding its way, was helping illuminate the path for others. Not because he had all the answers, but because he was willing to share the questions. After the talk, dozens of people approached him, each with their own story, each with their own difficulties, each looking for permission to transform, and Daniel gave it to them, the same way Thomas had given it to him, the same way his mother had shown him through her recovery, the same way every teacher appears when the student is ready. You don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to be willing to show up, to stay curious, to let difficulty teach you instead of just hurt you. That's enough. That's everything. Walking home through the city that night, Daniel looked up at the buildings around him, each one a structure, a plan made manifest, an architect's vision turned real. But he also saw the cracks, the weathering, the way time and use had changed them from their original blueprints. And instead of seeing failure, he saw evolution, adaptation, life. We're all under construction, he thought. All being weathered and changed by our experiences. The question isn't whether difficulty will come. It will. The question is whether we'll let it destroy us or transform us. He pulled out his phone and texted Leo. "Drinks tomorrow? I want to hear about your week." Then he texted Elena. "Movie night this weekend? My choice." Then his parents. "Love you both. See you Sunday." Small acts of connection, small choices toward presence, small moments of appreciating what was temporary while it was still here. Because, in the end, that's all any of us have. This moment, this breath, this choice, and the wisdom to recognize that when things don't go our way, sometimes they're going exactly where we need them to go. Daniel Torres, 29 years old, architect, son, friend, teacher, student, walked home through his city, grateful for the journey, ready for whatever came next, finally understanding that the best way to build a life wasn't to control every detail. It was to stay flexible enough to grow, brave enough to be uncomfortable, wise enough to let go, and generous enough to share what you learned along the way. The rest would take care of itself. It always does.